Pack your bags and get out of my son's house, Elena. You've overstayed your welcome here. Patricia's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, her perfectly manicured finger pointing toward the front door of what she believed was her territory to command. She stood there in her designer pantsuit, clutching her oversized Hermès bag like a weapon, her cold gray eyes scanning me with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of her shoe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I looked up from my laptop where I'd been working at the kitchen island, the same granite countertop I'd personally selected during the renovation 3 years ago. The same kitchen where I'd spent countless hours planning meals, hosting dinner parties, and building what I thought was a life with her son Michael. Now she was treating me like an unwelcome intruder in my own home. The divorce papers are final as of yesterday, Patricia continued, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Michael is overseas handling that important merger in Tokyo, but he made it very clear before he left that you needed to be gone by the time he returns. This house belongs to the Morrison family, and you were never really part of it, were you, dear? I set down my coffee cup with deliberate calmness, the same measured composure I'd perfected during my years working in commercial real estate law before I'd made the mistake of falling in love with her precious son. Patricia Morrison had made no secret of her disapproval from the moment Michael introduced me at that charity gala 5 years ago. To her, I was nothing more than a gold digger who'd somehow managed to trap her successful investment banker son into marriage. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. If she only knew the truth about whose name was actually on the deed to this sprawling Tudor-style mansion in Westchester County, she might have chosen her words more carefully. But Patricia had always been too consumed with her own sense of superiority to pay attention to details that didn't directly benefit her narrative. I understand you're upset about the divorce, I replied softly, maintaining the same tone I'd used throughout 4 years of her subtle and not-so-subtle attacks on my character. But I think there might be some confusion about the living arrangements. There's no confusion whatsoever, Patricia snapped, pulling out her phone with theatrical precision. I've already called the locksmith. They'll be here within the hour to change all the locks. I suggest you start packing immediately, unless you'd prefer to have your belongings placed on the curb for the neighbors to see. She paused dramatically, clearly savoring what she believed was my moment of defeat. I've also taken the liberty of calling my attorney to ensure you understand that any attempt to claim ownership of Morrison family property will be met with immediate legal action. You signed a prenuptial agreement, Elena. You get nothing from this marriage except whatever pathetic savings you managed to accumulate from your little legal secretary job. Legal secretary. The dismissive phrase had become Patricia's favorite way to describe my career. Despite the fact that I'd graduated summa cum laude from Columbia Law School and had spent 8 years building a successful practice in commercial real estate law before Michael and I married. She'd never bothered to learn the actual details of my professional background, preferring to maintain her fiction that I was an opportunistic nobody who'd somehow seduced her son away from more suitable prospects. What she also didn't know was that my specialty in commercial real estate law had made me exceptionally skilled at understanding property ownership structures, title transfers, and the kind of legal documentation that determined who actually owned what in complicated financial arrangements. Skills that had proven remarkably useful when Michael and I had purchased this house 3 years into our of watching someone try to evict me from a house that I legally owned. The irony was so perfect that I almost wanted to let her follow through with her threat just to see her face when the locksmith asked her to provide proof of ownership. Instead, I walked over to the kitchen drawer where I kept important documents, the same organized filing system that had served me well throughout my legal career. Patricia watched with growing irritation as I retrieved a leather portfolio that contained copies of all the property-related paperwork. Patricia, I said gently, opening the portfolio and extracting the deed and LLC operating agreement. I really think you should look at these documents before you call the locksmith. I don't need to look at anything, she replied dismissively, but I could see curiosity flickering behind her determined hostility. Whatever papers you think you have, they can't change the fact that this house belongs to the Morrison family. My son would never have signed away his inheritance to someone like you. Someone like me. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with all the class-conscious prejudice that Patricia had never bothered to disguise. In her mind, I was perpetually the inappropriate wife who'd somehow tricked her son into marriage, despite having no family money, no social connections, and no pedigree that would justify my presence in her carefully curated world. What made her dismissal particularly galling was that my background was actually quite impressive by any objective standard. I'd grown up in a working-class family in Queens, where my parents had instilled in me the kind of work ethic and determination that had carried me through law school on academic scholarships and into a successful career that I'd built entirely through my own efforts. But to Patricia, the absence of inherited wealth or social prominence made me fundamentally unsuitable for her son, regardless of my actual accomplishments. The truth was that I'd fallen in love with Michael despite his mother, not because of his family's social status. He was brilliant, funny, and genuinely kind when he wasn't trying to please his domineering mother. But 4 years of marriage had gradually revealed how thoroughly Patricia's influence shaped his decision-making, especially when it came to matters that she considered her domain. The divorce had been Patricia's idea from the beginning, though she'd been clever enough to plant seeds of doubt rather than issue direct ultimatums. She'd spent months undermining our marriage through subtle suggestions that I was holding Michael back professionally, that his colleagues were talking about his inappropriate choice of wife, that he'd be better positioned for advancement if he were married to someone from a more suitable background. Michael had initially resisted her pressure, but Patricia was nothing if not persistent. She'd cultivated relationships with several eligible women from prominent families, arranging casual encounters at social events and business functions. She'd made it clear that his career prospects would improve dramatically if he were available to marry someone who could provide the right social connections, rather than the professional embarrassment she claimed I represented. Eventually, the constant pressure had worn him down. Michael had become increasingly distant, spending longer hours at work and taking business trips that seemed designed more to avoid confrontation than to advance his career. When he'd finally asked for the divorce 6 months ago, he'd used all of Patricia's language about needing to focus on his professional future without the complications of an incompatible marriage. The prenuptial agreement Patricia had mentioned was real, and it had indeed limited my claims to Michael's personal assets. But what she didn't understand was that the house wasn't Michael's personal asset. It was a property owned by Morrison Family Properties LLC, of which I was the majority shareholder. The prenuptial agreement covered Michael's investment accounts, his business interests, and his personal property, but it said nothing about jointly owned.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Business entities or real estate investments we'd made during the marriage. Patricia, I tried again, holding out the deed for her inspection. This document shows the current ownership structure of the property. I think you'll find it interesting. She glanced at the papers with obvious irritation, clearly expecting to find some standard deed that would confirm her assumptions about Morrison family ownership. Instead, her expression gradually shifted from annoyance to confusion as she read the legal description and ownership details. "What is Morrison Family Properties LLC?" she demanded, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "It's the legal entity that owns this house," I explained patiently. "Michael and I created it when we purchased the property from the development company that had acquired it from your late husband's estate." Patricia's face went white as she processed the implications of what I'd just said. "That's impossible," she whispered. "This house was never sold. It's been in the Morrison family since it was built." I pulled out another document from my portfolio, a copy of the foreclosure notice and subsequent sale that had transferred the property out of the Morrison family estate 3.5 years ago. "Your husband's medical expenses and business debts created a situation where the estate couldn't maintain ownership," I explained gently. The house was sold to Clear Vista Development Partners, who planned to demolish it for a subdivision project. Patricia stared at the foreclosure documents with growing horror, realizing that her entire understanding of the family's financial situation had been based on incomplete information. Michael had clearly never explained the full extent of his father's financial difficulties, or the circumstances that had led to losing the family home. "But Michael inherited this house," she insisted, though her voice now carried more desperation than conviction. "He's lived here since we bought it back from the developers." "Actually, he's lived here since we bought it back from the developers," I corrected quietly. The purchase required substantial capital that I provided through my law practice and personal savings. Michael contributed what he could, but the majority of the investment came from my resources. I handed her the LLC operating agreement, watching as she struggled to understand the legal language that clearly outlined the ownership percentages. According to this agreement, which Michael signed when we created the company, I own 75% of Morrison Family Properties LLC, while Michael owns 25%. The silence that followed was unlike any I'd ever experienced with Patricia. For 4 years, she'd maintained absolute confidence in her ability to control every situation through sheer force of will and social authority. Now she was confronting legal documentation that undermined everything she'd believed about her family's position and her power to dictate terms to me. "You're saying you own this house?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying I own the majority interest in the company that owns this house," I clarified, "which means that any decisions about who lives here, who has access, and what happens to the property need to be made with my approval." Patricia sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her usual commanding presence deflated by the weight of documents she was holding. I could see her mind racing as she tried to find some angle, some legal loophole or technicality that would restore her sense of control over the situation. "Michael never told me about any of this," she said accusingly, as if my failure to inform her of private business arrangements somehow invalidated their legal standing. "Michael was focused on the emotional significance of getting his family home back," I replied. "The legal and financial details weren't something he wanted to worry about, so he trusted me to structure the arrangement appropriately." What I didn't say was that Michael's lack of attention to legal details had been a recurring theme throughout our marriage. He'd been happy to let me handle anything involving contracts, property, or financial planning, preferring to focus on his work while I managed the complexities of our shared life. It was an arrangement that had worked well when we were happy together, but it had created some interesting complications now that we were divorced. "This changes everything," Patricia muttered, still staring at the ownership documents as if they might transform into something more favorable to her position. "It doesn't change the divorce," I pointed out. "Michael and I are still getting divorced, and I have no interest in reconciliation. But it does change the assumptions you've been making about who has authority over this house." Patricia looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear and grudging respect that suggested she was finally beginning to understand that I might not be the pushover she'd always assumed I was. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly, abandoning the pretense of social superiority that had characterized all our previous interactions. "I want to finish my coffee and continue working on my laptop," I replied calmly. "I want to live peacefully in the house that I own without being harassed or threatened with eviction. And I want you to call off the locksmith before he arrives and embarrasses himself by trying to change locks on a property where he has no authorization to work." Patricia pulled out her phone and canceled the locksmith appointment, her movements sharp and angry as she realized how completely her morning's triumph had collapsed. When she finished the call, she looked at me with renewed hostility, though now it was tempered by the recognition that our power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. "You planned this," she accused. "You deliberately structured the ownership to put yourself in control." "I structured the ownership to protect the property and reflect each party's financial contribution," I corrected. "If that happened to put me in control, it's because I provided the majority of the capital required for the purchase." "But you knew Michael would never pay attention to the details," she pressed. "You took advantage of his emotional attachment to manipulate him into signing away his inheritance." "I protected his inheritance by making it possible for him to reclaim it in the first place," I replied firmly. "Without my intervention, this house would have been demolished 3 years ago and turned into a luxury subdivision. Michael would have inherited nothing but memories." Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh sound that seemed to punctuate her frustration. "This isn't over, Elena. I'll have my lawyers review these documents. There has to be some way to challenge this arrangement. You're welcome to have your lawyers review whatever you like," I said evenly. "But I should mention that the documents were prepared by Morrison, Chen and Associates, the same law firm that handled your late husband's estate planning. They're quite thorough in their work." The mention of her late husband's law firm seemed to deflate Patricia's remaining defiance. She'd clearly assumed that any legal work I'd done would be somehow inferior or vulnerable to challenge by more experienced attorneys. Learning that I'd used the same prestigious firm that had handled Morrison family legal matters for decades undermined her confidence in finding easy solutions. "How long do you plan to stay here?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was looking for some timeline that would allow her to maintain hope of eventual victory. "I plan to stay here as long as I own the house," I replied. "Whether that's 6 months or 60 years depends on various factors, but my ownership status isn't one of them." Patricia gathered her purse and the documents I'd shown her, clearly recognizing that she'd lost this particular battle, even if she wasn't ready to concede the war. As she walked toward the front door, she turned back with one final attempt at reasserting her authority. "When Michael returns from Tokyo, we'll see how he feels about this situation," she said. "He may own a minority stake in your little company, but he's still my son, and he still values family loyalty above legal technicalities." "I'm sure he does," I agreed pleasantly. "You should definitely discuss this with him when he gets back. I think he'll be very interested to learn about your visit this morning." After Patricia left, I sat back down at the kitchen island and reopened my laptop, returning to the work I'd been doing before her dramatic entrance. The morning's confrontation had been illuminating in ways I hadn't expected, revealing not just Patricia's ignorance about the property ownership, but also her complete lack of understanding about my professional background and capabilities. For 4 years, I'd allowed her to maintain her fiction about my status and qualifications, partly out of respect for Michael's relationship with his mother, and partly because I'd assumed that her opinion of me didn't matter, as long as Michael and I were happy together. Now that our marriage was ending, I was discovering that there were advantages to being consistently underestimated by people who considered themselves superior. The house felt different now that I'd asserted my actual authority over it. For months I'd been living here in a kind of limbo, uncertain about what would happen after the divorce was finalized and assuming that I'd need to find somewhere else to live. Patricia's attempt to evict me had forced me to confront the reality of my legal position, and I was surprised by how empowering it felt to realize that I didn't need anyone's permission to stay in my own home. My phone buzzed with a text message from my assistant at the law firm, where I'd returned to work part-time after the divorce proceedings began. "Patricia Morrison called asking for your personal cell number. I told her we don't give out personal contact information. Should I expect more calls?" I typed back a quick response. "Probably. If she calls again, tell her that any communication regarding property matters should go through my attorney. I'll send you the contact information." The truth was that I did have an attorney handling the divorce proceedings, but I'd been managing most of the property-related issues myself, since they fell within my area of expertise. However, given Patricia's threat to involve her own lawyers, it seemed prudent to establish some professional boundaries around any future discussions about the house. I spent the rest of the morning working on a commercial lease agreement for one of my clients, the familiar rhythm of legal research and document drafting providing a pleasant contrast to the morning's personal drama. The work reminded me of why I'd chosen real estate law in the first place. There was something satisfying about the precision required to structure complex transactions, the way that careful attention to detail could protect people's interests and prevent future conflicts. It occurred to me that my marriage to Michael had suffered from the opposite problem. We'd been so focused on the emotional and romantic aspects of our relationship that we'd never established clear boundaries or expectations about practical matters. I'd handled most of the financial and legal decisions by default, while Michael had focused on his career and assumed that everything else would work itself out. The arrangement had been functional, but ultimately unsustainable. When Patricia's pressure had intensified, and Michael had begun questioning whether our marriage was helping or hindering his professional goals, we'd had no framework for discussing these concerns constructively. Instead, we'd drifted apart gradually until the divorce had seemed like the path of least resistance. Now, sitting in the kitchen of the house I'd helped save from demolition, I was beginning to understand that the divorce might actually be the best outcome for both of us. Michael would be free to pursue whatever relationships and career opportunities he thought would make him happier, while I would be free to live according to my own values and priorities, rather than constantly managing Patricia's disapproval. The afternoon brought a call from Michael's assistant, asking if I could speak with him briefly during his lunch break in Tokyo. I agreed, curious about whether Patricia had already contacted him about the morning's events or if this was just coincidental timing. "Elena," Michael's voice came through clearly despite the international connection, his tone carrying the kind of professional courtesy he'd adopted for most of our conversations since the divorce proceedings began. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to check on a few practical matters before I get back to New York next week. I'm doing fine, thank you, I replied, settling into the living room where I could look out at the garden I'd spent 3 years cultivating. What did you need to discuss? There was a pause, and I could hear the sounds of a busy restaurant in the background, as Michael apparently considered how to approach whatever was on his mind. My mother called this morning, he said finally. She was quite upset about some kind of misunderstanding regarding the house. What kind of misunderstanding? I asked, though I was fairly certain I knew what direction this conversation was heading. She said you showed her some documents suggesting that you own the house rather than me, Michael continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to navigate a potentially explosive situation. I told her that couldn't be right, but she seemed very convinced that there was some kind of legal issue I wasn't aware of. I decided to handle this with the same directness I'd used with Patricia, partly because I respected Michael enough to be honest with him, and partly because there was no point in prolonging confusion about facts that could be easily verified. Michael, I said calmly, do you remember when we bought the house back from Clear Vista Development? You asked me to handle all the legal and financial arrangements because you were dealing with the emotional stress of potentially losing your family home. Of course I remember, he replied, though I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. You were amazing about managing all those details. I was so grateful that you could make it possible for us to get the house back. Do you remember the ownership structure I recommended for protecting the property? I asked gently. There was a longer pause this time, and I could almost hear Michael trying to recall legal details he'd deliberately avoided thinking about 3 years ago. You said something about creating a company to hold the title, he said slowly. Something about liability protection and tax advantages. That's right, I confirmed. Morrison Family Properties, LLC owns the house, and the ownership percentages in that company reflect each party's financial contribution to the purchase. Since I provided 75% of the capital, I own 75% of the company. The silence that followed was profound, stretching long enough that I wondered if the international connection had been dropped. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice much quieter than it had been at the beginning of our conversation. Elena, he said carefully, are you telling me that you own the house where I've been living for the past 3 years? I'm telling you that I own the majority interest in the company that owns the house, I clarified. You own 25%, which reflects your contribution to the purchase. The arrangement protects both of us, legally and financially. But I signed papers, Michael said, and I could hear him struggling to reconstruct memories of legal documents he'd signed without reading carefully. I remember signing papers about the house purchase. You signed the LLC operating agreement and various other documents related to the purchase, I agreed. Everything was handled properly from a legal standpoint, you just weren't focused on the ownership details at the time. Another long pause followed, and when Michael spoke again, his voice carried a different quality that suggested he was beginning to understand the implications of what he'd learned. So when my mother tried to evict you this morning, she was trying to evict you from a house that you legally own, he said, and I could hear something that might have been either amusement or dismay in his tone. That's an accurate summary, I confirmed. I showed her the documentation, and she canceled the locksmith appointment once she understood the situation. Michael laughed suddenly, a sound that was more rueful than amused. God, Elena, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she was planning to do that, and obviously I had no idea about the ownership situation. She must have been mortified when she realized her mistake. She was definitely surprised, I agreed diplomatically. What happens now? Michael asked. With the house, I mean. Are you planning to sell it? Buy out my share? I honestly don't know what the normal procedure is for this kind of situation. I hadn't really thought about long-term plans, I admitted. For now, I'm planning to continue living here. If you want to discuss selling the property or restructuring the ownership at some point, we can certainly have that conversation. Elena, Michael said, his voice becoming more serious, I want you to know that I never intended for this situation to become so complicated. When I asked for the divorce, I wasn't thinking about property ownership or who had rights to what. I was just focused on the relationship issues we'd been having. I know, I replied. The property arrangements were always separate from our personal relationship. The divorce doesn't change the legal structure we created when we bought the house. Are you going to be okay financially? Michael asked. I know the divorce settlement isn't very substantial, and I feel terrible about the way everything worked out. I'll be fine, I assured him. I'm back to working more hours at the firm, and my practice is doing well. the house situation actually provides some stability while I figure out what I want to do next. We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters like mail forwarding and personal belongings, but the conversation was notably different from our recent exchanges. Learning about the property ownership seemed to have shifted Michael's perspective on our entire relationship, reminding him of contributions I'd made that he'd largely forgotten about during the stress of the divorce proceedings. After we hung up, I realized that I felt better about our marriage and its ending than I had in months. The morning's confrontation with Patricia had forced both of them to recognize that I wasn't the passive, dependent wife they'd assumed I was. I'd built a successful career, structured complex financial transactions, and protected assets that had benefited the entire family, even if my contributions had been largely invisible to people who'd never bothered to pay attention to the details. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, with no further visits or dramatic phone calls to disrupt my work. I made dinner in the kitchen where Patricia had tried to evict me that morning, enjoying the simple pleasure of cooking in a space that I knew belonged to me rather than existing there by someone else's permission. As evening fell, I walked through the house I'd helped save from demolition, appreciating details that I'd been too stressed to notice during the difficult months of divorce proceedings. The renovations I'd overseen had preserved the original architectural character, while updating the infrastructure and systems. The landscaping I'd planned had matured into gardens that provided privacy and beauty throughout the changing seasons. This house represented more than just a financial investment or a place to live. It was a testament to my ability to solve complex problems, protect valuable assets, and create something beautiful and lasting even in the face of significant challenges. Patricia's attempt to evict me had reminded me of everything I'd accomplished, both professionally and personally, even if those accomplishments had been largely invisible to people who'd preferred to see me as Michael's dependent wife. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of the morning's events spread through Patricia's social network, and Michael processed the implications of our conversation. But tonight, I was content to enjoy the satisfaction of having stood up for myself in a situation where I'd been consistently underestimated, and to appreciate the home I'd worked so hard to preserve. The woman Patricia had tried to dismiss as a gold-digging legal secretary was actually the majority owner of the Morrison family property, a successful attorney with her own practice, and someone who'd spent years protecting assets and interests that others had taken for granted. It had taken a crisis to reveal these truths, but sometimes crisis was exactly what was needed to establish new understanding and respect. As I settled into the living room with a book and a glass of wine, I reflected on how dramatically the day had changed my perspective on both my past and my future. For months I'd been focused on what I was losing through the divorce. Now I was beginning to understand what I was gaining. The freedom to be recognized for who I actually was rather than who other people had assumed I was, and the opportunity to build a life based on my own values and priorities, rather than constantly managing other people's expectations and prejudices. The morning's confrontation had been unpleasant, but it had also been liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Patricia's attempt to exercise authority she didn't possess had forced me to assert authority I did possess, and the experience had reminded me of my own strength and competence in ways that would serve me well as I moved forward with my life. I was looking forward to seeing how Patricia would handle the new dynamic between us, and I was curious about whether Michael would develop a different understanding of our marriage now that he'd been reminded of my actual contributions to our shared life. But most of all, I was looking forward to continuing to live in the beautiful home I'd worked so hard to preserve, surrounded by evidence of my own capability and success, rather than constantly defending myself against other people's dismissive assumptions. The house felt peaceful as night fell, no longer the contested territory it had been that morning, but simply home in the truest sense of the word. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges and opportunities the future held, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in the place I'd earned through my own efforts and protected through my own expertise. Patricia Morrison had tried to evict me from what she thought was her son's house, never realizing that she was actually trying to evict me from my own property. The irony was perfect, and the justice of the situation was deeply satisfying. Sometimes, the best response to being underestimated was simply to reveal the truth about who you actually were and what you'd actually accomplished. And sometimes, that revelation was enough to change everything. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor at 7:30, when most reasonable people were still finishing their first cup of coffee. I looked through the peephole to see a tall man in an expensive suit standing on my front porch, briefcase in hand, and the kind of confident posture that suggested he was accustomed to being taken seriously wherever he went. I opened the door to find someone who could only be Patricia's attorney, given the timing and his obvious preparation for what he probably assumed would be a simple intimidation visit. He looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of patrician bearing that suggested decades of representing wealthy families in matters they preferred to handle quietly and efficiently. "Good morning," he said with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask his underlying assumption that this conversation would be brief and decisive. "I'm Richard Blackwood from Blackwood Sterling & Associates. I represent Patricia Morrison in certain family matters. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time to discuss some property concerns that have recently come to light." "Of course," I replied, stepping aside to let him enter. I had been expecting this visit since Patricia's hasty retreat the previous morning, and I was curious to see what legal strategy she'd developed overnight to challenge my position. Blackwood's eyes swept over the interior of the house with the kind of appraising glance that lawyers develop when evaluating assets that might become relevant to their cases. He took in the original hardwood floors, the carefully restored moldings, and the tasteful blend of antique and contemporary furnishings that I'd assembled over 3 years of making this place feel like home. "This is quite a beautiful property," he observed, as we settled in the living room. "I can understand why the Morrison family has such strong emotional attachment to it, given its history with the family." "It is beautiful," I agreed, pouring coffee from the service I'd prepared after spotting his car in the driveway. "I've enjoyed taking care of it during the time I've lived here." Blackwood accepted the coffee with the kind of automatic politeness that suggested he was already formulating his opening arguments. "Mrs. Morrison has shared with me some rather surprising information about property ownership documents you presented to her yesterday. I have to say, the situation she described seems quite unusual for a marital asset." "What specifically seems unusual to you?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him with my own coffee cup. "Well," he began, pulling out a legal pad where he'd apparently prepared talking points for this conversation. "Mrs. Morrison was under the impression that this house has been continuously owned by the Morrison family since it was constructed in 1952. The suggestion that it might now be owned by a limited liability company with disputed ownership percentages raises some interesting questions about asset concealment and potential fraud." I felt a familiar flutter of professional interest at hearing another lawyer's approach to a complex situation, even when that approach was directed against my own interests. Blackwood was clearly skilled at his job, beginning with accusations serious enough to put me on the defensive while maintaining plausible deniability about whether he was actually making formal allegations. "Mr. Blackwood," I said calmly, "I assume you've had an opportunity to review the public records regarding this property before making any suggestions about fraud or asset concealment." His slight pause told me that he hadn't, in fact, done the basic research that would have revealed the property's actual ownership history. Patricia had clearly contacted him in a state of agitation, demanding immediate action without providing the kind of comprehensive background information that would allow him to develop an effective legal strategy. "I've reviewed the information provided by my client," he said carefully, "which suggests that there may be some irregularities in how this property was transferred and titled." I walked over to the desk where I kept copies of all the relevant documentation, the same organized filing system that had served me well in my own legal practice. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, returning with a folder that contained everything he would need to understand the situation, "I think you'll find it helpful to review the actual legal history of this property before we continue our discussion." I handed him copies of the foreclosure notice that had forced the sale of the house from the Morrison family estate, the purchase agreement between the estate and Clear Vista Development Partners, the subsequent purchase agreement between Clear Vista and Morrison Family Properties LLC, and the operating agreement that established the ownership structure of the company. Blackwood read through the documents with the kind of focused attention that good lawyers bring to unfamiliar legal territory, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something that might have been professional respect, as he absorbed the complexity and thoroughness of the documentation. "This is quite comprehensive," he said finally, setting down the papers and looking at me with new awareness that I might not be the easily intimidated layperson he'd been expecting to encounter. "You structured this as a business acquisition rather than a personal real estate purchase." "That's correct," I confirmed. "Given the complex circumstances of the property's availability and the substantial capital required for the purchase, A business structure provided better protection and flexibility for all parties involved. And you're telling me that Michael Morrison voluntarily signed agreements giving you majority control of the entity that owns his family's ancestral home? Blackwood's tone suggested he was still looking for some angle that would support Patricia's position. Michael Morrison voluntarily signed agreements that allocated ownership based on each party's financial contribution to the purchase, I corrected. The control issue was a natural consequence of the investment structure, not a goal in itself. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, clearly reassessing both the legal situation and his client's chances of achieving whatever outcome she'd hired him to pursue. Mrs. Morrison led me to believe that you had somehow tricked her son into signing away his inheritance through deceptive practices. Mr. Blackwood, I said with the kind of patience I'd learned to employ when dealing with opposing counsel who'd been misinformed by their clients. Michael Morrison's inheritance was lost to foreclosure before I ever became involved in this situation. The house he inherited was the opportunity to buy back his family property, which I made possible through my financial resources and legal expertise. I could see Blackwood processing the implications of what I just explained, recognizing that his client had fundamentally misunderstood both the legal situation and the power dynamics at play. Patricia had hired him to challenge what she perceived as an illegitimate transfer of Morrison family property, only to discover that the property had already been lost by the Morrison family before I'd rescued it. You practice law yourself, Blackwood observed, though it was more statement than question. Commercial real estate law, I confirmed. This property acquisition fell well within my area of expertise. And you structured this transaction professionally, with proper legal representation and documentation, he continued, clearly beginning to understand that any challenge to the ownership structure would need to overcome the presumption that it had been handled competently by qualified professionals. I used Morrison, Chen and Associates for the legal work, I replied. I believe they also handle matters for the Morrison family, so I'm sure you could verify the quality of their work if you have any concerns about the documentation. The mention of Morrison, Chen and Associates seemed to deflate whatever remaining hope Blackwood might have harbored for finding easy weaknesses in my legal position. The firm was one of the most prestigious in the region, with a reputation for thorough and conservative legal work that would be difficult to challenge on technical grounds. Mrs. Morrison is going to be disappointed, he said with the frankness that sometimes emerges between lawyers when they recognize that their clients' expectations were unrealistic from the beginning. I imagine she will be, I agreed. But perhaps this will help her understand that the situation is more complex than she initially realized. Blackwood gathered the documents I'd shown him, clearly preparing to deliver news to Patricia that would not be well received. Before he left, however, he turned back with the kind of question that suggested he was personally curious about aspects of the situation that went beyond his professional responsibilities. How long have you been practicing real estate law, he asked. 8 years before I married Michael, I replied. I took a step back from full-time practice during our marriage, but I've been increasing my client load again since the divorce proceedings began. And you handled this entire transaction yourself, without outside counsel? I handled the preliminary negotiations and structure, then worked with Morrison, Chen and Associates for the formal documentation and closing, I explained. It seemed prudent to use established counsel given the complexity of the family situation. Blackwood nodded with what appeared to be genuine professional respect. It's an impressive piece of work, he said. Complex enough to achieve your goals while simple enough to be enforceable. Your husband was fortunate to have access to that level of expertise. After he left, I realized that his visit had accomplished something Patricia probably hadn't intended. By sending a respected attorney to challenge my legal position, she'd inadvertently provided me with professional validation from someone whose opinion carried weight in the legal community. Blackwood's recognition that my work was competent and enforceable would make it much more difficult for Patricia to claim that I'd somehow manipulated or deceived Michael during the property acquisition. The morning's second surprise came in the form of a phone call from Margaret Chen, one of the senior partners at Morrison, Chen and Associates and the attorney who'd supervised the original property transaction. I'd worked with Margaret on several commercial deals over the years, and she'd always impressed me with her combination of technical expertise and strategic thinking. Elena, Margaret's voice was warm but carried an undertone of professional concern. Richard Blackwood called this morning, asking some very pointed questions about the Morrison property transaction we handled for you 3 years ago. I thought you should know that he seemed to be fishing for information about potential irregularities in the documentation. I appreciate the heads up, I replied, settling into my office to give Margaret my full attention. Patricia Morrison hired him to challenge the ownership structure, but I think he realized pretty quickly that there's nothing to challenge. I reviewed our files after his call, Margaret continued, and I wanted to confirm that everything we did was handled according to standard practices for this type of acquisition. The ownership allocation was based on documented financial contributions. The LLC structure was appropriate for the asset protection goals you identified, and Michael Morrison had independent legal representation throughout the process. That's my recollection as well, I confirmed. Michael used Johnson & Associates for his personal legal review, if I remember correctly. Exactly, Margaret said. So if anyone raises questions about whether he understood what he was signing, we have documentation that he had qualified counsel explaining everything to him. That should address any potential claims about undue influence or lack of informed consent. The conversation with Margaret reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten in the drama of Patricia's eviction attempt and Blackwood's visit. When we'd structured the property acquisition, I'd insisted that Michael have independent legal representation specifically to avoid any future claims that I'd taken advantage of his emotional attachment to the house or his lack of expertise in real estate law. At the time, Michael had grumbled about the additional expense and complexity, arguing that he trusted me to handle everything fairly. But I'd been firm about following best practices for transactions between family members, requiring that each party have separate legal counsel and that all decisions be documented with appropriate formality. That caution was now protecting both of us from exactly the kind of challenges that Patricia was attempting to raise. Even if she could prove that Michael hadn't paid close attention to the ownership details, which was probably true, she couldn't claim that he hadn't been properly advised by qualified counsel about the implications of what he was signing. The afternoon brought yet another unexpected development when Michael called from Tokyo to discuss what he'd learned from his conversation with his mother about Blackwood's visit to see me. Elena. Michael's voice carried a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been admiration. My mother told me that her attorney came to see you this morning and left convinced that there's no legal basis for challenging the property ownership. She's furious about it, but I have to admit I'm impressed. It wasn't a difficult conversation, I replied diplomatically. Mr. Blackwood is a competent attorney who understood the situation once he had access to proper documentation. My mother also mentioned that you used Morrison, Chen, and Associates for the legal work, Michael continued. I didn't remember that detail, but it explains why everything was handled so professionally. They don't take on matters unless they're confident about the legal structure. I thought it was important to use established counsel given the complexity of the situation, I explained. Margaret Chen supervised the work personally, and you had independent representation from Johnson & Associates. There was a pause in our conversation, and when Michael spoke again, his tone was more thoughtful than it had been in months. Elena, I owe you an apology. Not just for my mother's behavior yesterday, but for not recognizing how much work you put into saving our family home. I was so focused on the emotional aspects of getting the house back that I didn't appreciate the legal and financial complexity of what you accomplished. You were dealing with a lot of stress at the time, I replied. The important thing was that we were able to preserve the property for the family. But that's just it, Michael said. I keep saying we preserved it for the family, but you're the one who made it possible. You provided most of the capital, you structured the legal arrangements, you managed the entire process. I may have grown up in that house, but you're the reason it still exists. I was touched by his recognition of my contributions, even though it was coming 3 years after the fact and in the context of our divorce. For most of our marriage, I'd been content to work behind the scenes, while Michael received credit for successes that we'd achieved together. Now that our personal relationship was ending, it felt meaningful to have him acknowledge my actual role in preserving something that mattered so much to him. There's something else I need to tell you, Michael continued, his voice becoming more serious. My mother has been pressuring me for months to find a way to get you out of the house. She's convinced that having my ex-wife living in the family home reflects poorly on our social standing, and she's been quite persistent about finding legal solutions to what she saw as an embarrassing situation. I had suspected as much, given the timing and confidence of Patricia's eviction attempt, but hearing it confirmed helped me understand the broader context of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about property ownership or divorce settlements. It was about Patricia's desire to erase my presence from her family's life as completely as possible. She hired Blackwood before consulting with me about the ownership situation, Michael explained. I think she assumed that any legal arrangements you'd made could be easily challenged or overturned. She didn't expect to discover that you actually own the majority of the property. What does she want to do now? I asked, curious about whether Patricia would accept the legal reality or continue looking for ways to challenge my position. She's talking about offering to buy out your ownership stake, Michael replied, though I suspect she's hoping you'll accept less than fair market value in exchange for avoiding a prolonged legal dispute. I considered this possibility, recognizing that a buyout could provide me with capital to invest in other opportunities while freeing me from the complications of shared ownership with Michael's family. On the other hand, I'd grown to love the house and the gardens I'd cultivated, and I wasn't eager to give up my home simply to accommodate Patricia's social anxieties. If she wants to make a formal offer, I'm willing to listen, I said finally. But it would need to reflect the actual market value of the property and my majority ownership position. I'll let her know, Michael agreed, though I should warn you that she's not accustomed to negotiating from a position of weakness, so she may not handle this situation gracefully. After our conversation ended, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of the past 2 days' events. Patricia's attempt to evict me had been motivated by her desire to control her family's image and eliminate what she saw as an embarrassing reminder of Michael's inappropriate marriage. But her strategy had backfired, forcing everyone involved to recognize that I wasn't the dependent, powerless ex-wife she'd assumed I was. Instead of succeeding in removing me from the family property, she'd highlighted my actual status as the majority owner and revealed the extent to which she'd misunderstood both my professional capabilities and my legal position. Her attempt to exercise authority she didn't possess had forced me to assert authority I did possess, fundamentally changing the power dynamics of our relationship. The evening brought a call from my friend Jennifer, a fellow attorney who specialized in family law and had been following my divorce proceedings with professional interest. Jennifer had been one of my closest friends in law school, and she'd maintained her practice throughout her own marriage and children in ways that I'd sometimes envied during my years of reduced professional activity. Elena, she said without preamble when I answered the phone, I heard through the legal gossip network that Patricia Morrison tried to have you evicted from your own house. Please tell me the rumors are true, because that would be the most delicious irony I've encountered in years of family law practice. The rumors are essentially accurate, I confirmed, settling into my office chair with a glass of wine as I prepared to share the story with someone who would appreciate both the legal and personal aspects of what had transpired. Jennifer's laughter was infectious as I recounted Patricia's confident arrival with threats of locksmith appointments and legal action, followed by her gradual realization that she was trying to evict the actual property owner. As a family law attorney, Jennifer had seen numerous cases where divorcing spouses made assumptions about asset ownership that proved to be incorrect, but she'd never encountered a situation quite this dramatic. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, Jennifer said when I finished my account. Patricia Morrison, who has spent years treating you like an unwelcome gold digger, tried to kick you out of a house that you actually own a controlling interest in, using legal threats that had no basis in reality, while her son was on the other side of the world completely unaware of her actions. That's an accurate summary, I agreed. And when her attorney came to intimidate you into compliance, he ended up recognizing that your legal work was too competent to challenge, effectively providing professional validation for the very ownership structure Patricia was trying to attack. Also accurate, I confirmed. Elena, Jennifer said, with the kind of admiration that only another attorney could properly appreciate, this is the most perfect example of strategic patience and superior preparation triumphing over arrogance and assumed privilege that I've ever witnessed. You've been playing chess while everyone else thought you were playing checkers. Her analysis reminded me of something I'd been thinking about since Blackwood's visit that morning. For years, I'd been frustrated by the way Patricia dismissed my professional accomplishments and treated me as an insignificant appendage to her son's life. But her consistent underestimation of my capabilities had actually provided me with a significant strategic advantage when conflicts arose. Because she'd never bothered to understand my actual background or qualifications, Patricia had developed tactics for dealing with me that were based on completely incorrect assumptions about my resources and expertise. She'd approached our confrontation as if she were dealing with someone who could be easily intimidated or confused by legal complexity, never realizing that she was actually challenging someone whose professional specialty was exactly the type of transaction she was questioning. The mismatch between her expectations and reality had made her defeat inevitable, but it had also made it more complete than it might have been if she'd approached the situation with accurate information about what she was up against. "What are you planning to do now?" Jennifer asked. "Are you going to stay in the house or use this as leverage for some kind of settlement?" "I haven't decided yet," I admitted. "Part of me enjoys the idea of staying here just to prove that I can. But another part of me wonders if it might be better to sell my interest and use the capital for new opportunities." Jennifer was quiet for a moment before responding with the kind of insight that had made her one of the most successful family lawyers in the city. "Elena," she said finally, "I think you should consider what message you want to send about how people like Patricia should expect to be treated when they underestimate and dismiss women with real capabilities." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Patricia has probably spent decades using social pressure and intimidation tactics to get her way with people she considers beneath her," Jennifer explained. "If you give in to her pressure now, even in exchange for fair compensation, you're reinforcing her belief that these tactics work, and that she can ultimately control situations through sheer force of will and social authority. But if you stay in the house and build a successful life there, despite her disapproval and social objections, you're demonstrating that competence and legal rights matter more than social pretensions and inherited privilege. You're proving that she can't simply wish away inconvenient realities by applying enough pressure." Jennifer's perspective made me realize that my decision about the house was about more than just personal comfort or financial considerations. It was about establishing principles for how I wanted to be treated going forward, and what kinds of behavior I was willing to accept from people who had spent years dismissing and undervaluing me. The next morning brought news that Patricia had scheduled a meeting with a real estate appraiser, apparently moving forward with her plan to make a buyout offer, despite not yet having received any indication that I was interested in selling. The appraiser's visit was scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving me a weekend to consider how I wanted to respond to whatever offer might emerge from his evaluation. I spent Saturday morning working in the garden, the physical activity helping me think through the various factors that should influence my decision. The house represented more than just a financial asset, or a place to live. It was a symbol of my ability to solve complex problems and protect valuable things, even in the face of family opposition and social pressure. The gardens I'd planted and tended for 3 years were beginning to reach maturity, creating the kind of established landscape that takes patience and long-term vision to achieve. Walking among the roses and perennials I'd chosen and positioned, I was reminded of the satisfaction that comes from building something beautiful and lasting through careful planning and sustained effort. The house itself had become a showcase for my abilities in ways that went beyond the legal and financial aspects of its acquisition. The renovations I'd overseen had preserved its historical character while updating its functionality for modern living. The interior design I'd developed reflected both my personal taste and my understanding of what would work best in the space. More importantly, the house had become my home in the deepest sense of the word. It was where I'd learned to balance my professional ambitions with my personal relationships, where I'd developed my skills in project management and renovation oversight, where I'd created spaces for entertaining friends and colleagues in ways that reflected my own style rather than inherited family traditions. Patricia's offer to buy me out would provide financial resources that could fund other opportunities, but it would also require me to give up the home I'd worked so hard to preserve and improve. The decision would ultimately come down to whether I valued the symbolic importance of staying in the house more than the practical advantages of liquidating my investment. Sunday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor when Michael's younger sister Caroline appeared at my front door, clearly nervous about whatever conversation she'd come to have. Caroline and I had always gotten along well, partly because she'd never shared Patricia's social pretensions, and partly because she'd genuinely appreciated my efforts to welcome her into family gatherings and holiday celebrations. "Elena," Caroline said as I invited her in for coffee, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I heard about what happened with Mother last week, and I wanted to apologize for her behavior." "You don't need to apologize for anything," I replied. settling into the living room with Caroline and appreciating the opportunity to talk with someone from Michael's family who didn't seem to view me as an adversary. "Actually, I think I do," Caroline said firmly. "Mother has been saying terrible things about you for years, and none of us have done enough to push back against her unfairness. She's convinced herself that you were somehow taking advantage of Michael, when it's obvious to anyone who pays attention that you've been nothing but generous and supportive of our family." Caroline went on to explain that she'd been following the property ownership revelation with fascination, finally understanding how I'd managed to save the family home that she'd assumed was lost forever when their father's estate had been settled. "I remember when Michael told us that the house had been sold to developers," she said. "We all thought it was gone forever, and Michael was devastated about losing his childhood home. Then suddenly he was living there again, and everyone just accepted that he'd somehow managed to buy it back without asking too many questions about how that had been possible. It was important to Michael to preserve the family connection to the house," I explained. "I was just in a position to help make that happen." "But you weren't just in a position to help," Caroline pointed out. "You were the person who made it happen, using your own money and expertise to save something that mattered to our family. And instead of being grateful, Mother has spent years treating you like you were somehow unworthy of the life you helped create." Caroline's recognition of my contributions meant more to me than I'd expected, partly because she was the first member of Michael's family to acknowledge what I'd actually done rather than what they'd assumed I'd done. Her perspective reminded me that not everyone in the family shared Patricia's dismissive attitude, even if they hadn't been vocal about their disagreement. "What's Mother planning to do now?" Caroline asked. "Michael mentioned that she's talking about making you an offer for the house." "She's having it appraised this week," I replied. "I assume she'll make some kind of buyout proposal based on whatever valuation she receives." "Are you planning to accept?" Caroline's question carried genuine concern, rather than the ulterior motives that had characterized most of my recent conversations about the house. "I haven't decided yet," I admitted. "There are advantages to selling, but I've also grown attached to living here." Caroline was quiet for a moment, clearly considering how to express whatever she was thinking. "Elena," she said finally, "I hope you'll consider staying. Not just because it would serve Mother right for underestimating you, though that would certainly be satisfying, but because this house has never been more beautiful or better cared for than it has been during the time you've lived here." She gestured around the living room, taking in the carefully chosen furnishings, the restored architectural details, and the flowers from my garden that I'd arranged on the mantelpiece. "You've made this place a real home in ways that it never was when we were growing up here. It would be a shame to lose that just because Mother can't handle being wrong about who you really are." Caroline's visit reminded me that my decision about the house would affect more people than just Patricia and myself. Michael's sister had spent her childhood in these rooms, and she clearly appreciated the care I'd taken to preserve and enhance the spaces that held her family's memories, while creating new beauty that reflected my own aesthetic sensibilities. After Caroline left, I spent the evening researching comparable property sales in the area, wanting to have my own understanding of the house's market value before Patricia's appraiser provided his assessment. The research confirmed what I'd suspected. The combination of the house's location, size, and the improvements I'd made over 3 years had created substantial equity that would provide significant financial resources if I chose to sell. But the financial analysis also reminded me of how much I'd invested in making this place home, both in terms of money and emotional energy. The renovations, landscaping, and decorating had been labors of love that had created value beyond what could be captured in any appraisal report. Monday morning brought a call from Margaret Chen with news that would complicate Patricia's buyout strategy. "Elena," Margaret said, "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the Morrison property, and I realize there's an aspect of the ownership structure that might be relevant to any future transactions." "What aspect?" I asked, settling into my office to give Margaret my full attention. "The LLC operating agreement includes right of first refusal provisions that require approval from all members before any ownership interests can be sold to outside parties," Margaret explained. "If Patricia wants to buy out your interest, Michael would need to agree to the transaction as the minority owner." I pulled out my copy of the operating agreement and reviewed the relevant sections, realizing that Margaret was correct about the restrictions on ownership transfers. The provision had been included as a standard protective measure for business entities with multiple owners, but I hadn't considered its implications for potential buyout scenarios. So Patricia can't simply make me an offer and expect to complete a purchase based on my acceptance alone, I said, working through the legal implications. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. Michael would need to either approve the sale to his mother or exercise his own right to purchase your interest at the same price she's offering. The provision was designed to prevent outside parties from gaining control of the entity without the consent of existing members. This development added another layer of complexity to Patricia's strategy, requiring her to coordinate with Michael in ways that she'd clearly been hoping to avoid. It also gave Michael leverage in the situation that he might not have realized he possessed, since he could potentially block any sale that he didn't approve of or acquire additional ownership himself if he chose to exercise his rights under the operating agreement. The morning's second call came from Michael himself, apparently responding to whatever conversation he'd had with his mother about the appraisal she'd scheduled for the following day. "Elena," Michael said, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was trying to navigate between conflicting pressures, "my mother wanted me to ask if you'd be willing to meet with her appraiser tomorrow to provide access to all areas of the house." "Of course," I replied, though I should mention that Margaret Chen reminded me about the ownership transfer restrictions in our LLC agreement. "Any sale would need to be approved by both members, and you'd have the right to match any offer she makes." There was a pause as Michael processed this information, clearly recognizing that his mother's buyout plan was more complicated than she'd realized. "I hadn't thought about those provisions," he admitted. "Does that mean I could prevent a sale if I wanted to?" "It means you could prevent a sale to your mother," I clarified. "Though you could also choose to purchase my interest yourself if you preferred that option." Michael was quiet for a moment before responding with something that sounded like genuine curiosity. "Elena, can I ask you something? Are you planning to fight my mother on this, or are you open to negotiating some kind of resolution that works for everyone?" I considered his question carefully, recognizing that my answer would influence how both he and Patricia approached. "Future discussions about the house. I'm open to negotiating a fair resolution," I said finally, "but any agreement would need to reflect the actual legal and financial realities of the situation, not your mother's assumptions about what she thinks should happen." "That's fair," Michael agreed. "I just wanted to understand your perspective before I talk with my mother about how to handle the appraisal and any subsequent discussions." After ending the call, I realized that the next phase of this situation would require me to decide not just whether I wanted to stay in the house, but what principles I wanted to establish for how Patricia and I would interact going forward. Her initial attempt to simply evict me had failed, but her buyout strategy represented a more sophisticated approach to achieving the same goal of removing me from her family's life. The question was whether I would allow her to purchase that outcome, even at fair market value, or whether I would insist on maintaining my position regardless of the financial considerations involved. The decision would ultimately determine whether Patricia learned that her intimidation tactics didn't work, or whether she learned that persistence and sufficient financial resources could eventually overcome inconvenient legal realities. As I prepared for the appraiser's visit the following day, I found myself thinking about all the women I'd known who'd been dismissed or underestimated by people like Patricia, only to accept settlements or compromises that reinforced the very attitudes that had created problems in the first place. Jennifer's words about the broader implications of my decision resonated more strongly with each passing hour. This wasn't just about a house or a family dispute or even my own personal comfort. It was about establishing precedents for how capable women should respond when they're consistently undervalued, and whether they should accept financial compensation for giving up positions they'd earned through their own expertise and hard work. The stakes were higher than I'd initially realized, and the decision would require me to choose between the security of a substantial financial settlement and the satisfaction of proving that competence and legal rights couldn't be bought away by people who preferred more convenient narratives about who belonged where and why. Tuesday morning arrived with the precision of an appointment that everyone involved knew would be crucial to determining what happened next. The appraiser Patricia had hired was prompt, professional, and clearly experienced in evaluating high-end residential properties. He spent 3 hours measuring rooms, photographing architectural details, and taking notes about the improvements and renovations that had been completed during my ownership. By the time he finished his work, I was confident that his report would reflect the substantial value that my investments had created, regardless of whatever outcome Patricia was hoping to achieve through the appraisal process. The only question remaining was whether the fair market value he determined would be sufficient to persuade me to give up the home I'd worked so hard to preserve and improve. That answer would determine whether Patricia's latest strategy succeeded where her intimidation tactics had failed, or whether she would finally be forced to accept that some problems couldn't be solved simply by applying enough money and social pressure to make inconvenient people disappear. The appraiser's report arrived on Friday morning, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope that Patricia had clearly instructed should come directly to me rather than through her attorney. The professional assessment confirmed what I'd expected. The house was now valued at $2.08 million, representing a substantial increase from the $1.09 million we'd paid to Clear Vista Development 3 years earlier. More importantly, the report specifically noted the improvements I'd made, crediting the renovated kitchen, restored hardwood floors, updated electrical and plumbing systems, and professionally designed landscaping with adding approximately $400,000 in value to the property. The appraiser had been thorough in documenting how my investments had enhanced both the functionality and market appeal of the house. Within an hour of receiving the appraisal, my phone rang with a call from Patricia herself, her voice carrying a brittle courtesy that suggested she was working hard to control whatever emotions the valuation had provoked. "Elena," she began, "I trust you've had an opportunity to review the property assessment. I think you'll agree that the value reflects the high-end nature of the neighborhood and the quality of the improvements that have been made over the years." "It's certainly a thorough evaluation," I replied carefully, recognizing that Patricia was attempting to establish a collaborative tone that hadn't characterized any of our previous conversations. "Given the assessed value and your majority ownership position," she continued, "I'm prepared to offer you $2.01 million for your 75% interest in the property. That represents the fair market value of your stake, and it would allow you to realize the full benefit of your investment while providing my family with the opportunity to maintain our historical connection to the house." I did quick mental calculations, recognizing that Patricia's offer was exactly what the numbers suggested my ownership percentage was worth. She was being scrupulously fair from a financial standpoint, which made her proposal harder to dismiss than it would have been if she'd tried to lowball me or pressure me into accepting less than market value. "That's certainly a fair offer from a mathematical perspective," I acknowledged. "Can I ask what your timeline is for needing a decision?" "I'd like to resolve this situation as quickly as possible," Patricia replied, though her tone suggested she was making an effort to sound reasonable rather than demanding. "Perhaps we could finalize everything within the next 2 weeks?" The conversation was surreal in its civility, given the hostility that had characterized Patricia's previous interactions with me. She was clearly making a strategic decision to treat me as a legitimate negotiating partner rather than an obstacle to be removed, though I suspected this change in approach was motivated more by legal necessity than genuine respect. After ending the call, I realized that Patricia's offer created exactly the kind of decision point that Jennifer had predicted. I could accept $2.01 million in exchange for walking away from the house and the ongoing complications of shared ownership with Michael's family, or I could decline the offer and establish that my position couldn't be purchased regardless of the financial incentives involved. The money would provide substantial resources for other opportunities, including the possibility of purchasing another property that wouldn't come with the emotional baggage of family conflicts and social tensions. But accepting the buyout would also validate Patricia's belief that persistence and sufficient financial resources could eventually overcome inconvenient legal realities. I spent the weekend considering the decision from every angle I could think of, weighing financial considerations against personal principles and trying to anticipate the long-term consequences of either choice. By Sunday evening, I'd reached a conclusion that felt both surprising and inevitable. Monday morning brought a call to Patricia that would reshape our relationship permanently. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I've given careful consideration to your offer, and I've decided not to sell my interest in the house." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Patricia finally spoke, her voice carried a strain that suggested she was struggling to maintain the reasonable tone she'd adopted for our recent negotiations. "May I ask why you've decided to decline what I believe is a very fair financial offer?" she said finally. "The offer is indeed fair," I acknowledged. "But I've realized that this decision isn't really about money. It's about establishing principles for how I want to be treated going forward. I don't understand what you mean, Patricia replied, though her tone suggested she understood perfectly but was hoping I might explain myself in ways that would give her new angles to pursue. Patricia, I said clearly, for 4 years you've treated me as if I were an unwelcome intruder in your family's life. You've dismissed my professional accomplishments, questioned my motives, and made it clear that you considered me fundamentally unsuitable for your son. When our marriage ended, you immediately began strategizing about how to remove me from what you saw as my temporary and inappropriate presence in your family's property. But the house isn't your family's property, I continued. It's my property, acquired through my professional expertise and financial resources. Your attempt to evict me was based on assumptions about both my legal position and my personal character that turned out to be completely wrong. Elena, Patricia said, her carefully maintained courtesy beginning to crack. I think you're overcomplicating what should be a straightforward business transaction. On the contrary, I replied, I think you're underestimating what this transaction represents. If I accept your buyout offer, I'm essentially allowing you to purchase the outcome you wanted when you tried to have me evicted. I'm teaching you that persistence and sufficient financial pressure can overcome legal rights and professional accomplishments when the people involved are inconvenient to your preferred narrative. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Patricia alternating between attempts to appeal to my financial interests and barely concealed frustration that I wasn't responding to incentives that she clearly believed should be compelling. When she finally realized that I wouldn't be changing my mind, her tone shifted to something more familiar. This is a mistake, Elena, she said coldly. You're choosing to prolong an uncomfortable situation for everyone involved, rather than accepting a generous resolution that would benefit both parties. I'm choosing to live in my own home rather than accepting payment to make your life more convenient, I corrected. There's a difference. After ending the call, I felt a sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in months. The decision to keep the house wasn't just about the property itself, though I did love living there. It was about refusing to allow someone who had consistently undervalued me to purchase their way out of the consequences of their misconceptions. Patricia had spent years treating me as if my presence in her family's life was temporary and inappropriate. Now she was discovering that her ability to control the situation was much more limited than she'd assumed, and that some problems couldn't be solved simply by writing checks large enough to make inconvenient people disappear. The next phase of our relationship would be determined by how she chose to respond to this limitation on her authority, and whether she could learn to coexist with someone whose legal position she couldn't challenge, and whose principles she couldn't purchase. Wednesday brought news that Patricia had decided to escalate her efforts in a different direction. Caroline called to warn me that their mother was planning to make Michael an offer to purchase my interest in the house, apparently hoping that family loyalty would succeed where financial incentives had failed. She's convinced herself that Michael will be more motivated to resolve this situation than you are, Caroline explained. She thinks he'll be willing to pay above market value to avoid the ongoing complications of shared ownership with his ex-wife. The strategy was clever in its way, recognizing that Michael might indeed find the current arrangement uncomfortable enough to justify overpaying for a resolution. But it also demonstrated Patricia's continued failure to understand the legal constraints that governed ownership transfers, specifically the provisions that gave me the right to approve or reject any proposed buyer. When Michael called that evening to discuss his mother's latest proposal, I could hear the exhaustion in his voice that suggested he was getting tired of being caught between Patricia's demands and the legal realities of our ownership structure. Elena, he said, my mother wants to loan me the money to buy out your interest in the house. She's offering to provide $3 million, which is above the appraised value of your stake. I wanted to ask if that would change your position on selling. Michael, I replied gently, the issue isn't the amount of money being offered. If you want to purchase my interest because you genuinely want to own the house yourself, that's a conversation we can have. But if you're only considering it because your mother is pressuring you to solve her social discomfort, then we're not really talking about a legitimate business transaction. There was a long pause before Michael responded with something that sounded like relief. You're right, he said. I've been thinking about this all wrong. The truth is, I don't actually want to own the house by myself. It's too big for one person, too expensive to maintain, and it comes with too many memories that I'm still trying to process. What do you want to do? I asked. Honestly? Michael said, I'd like to sell my 25% interest to you and use the money to buy something smaller that feels more like my own space rather than a monument to family history that I'm not sure I want to preserve. The suggestion surprised me, though it made sense when I considered Michael's actual lifestyle and preferences. He'd always been more comfortable in urban environments than suburban estates, and he'd often seemed overwhelmed by the responsibility of maintaining a property as large and complex as his family's house. If you're serious about that, I'm interested in discussing it, I said. Though I should point out that purchasing your interest would make me the sole owner, which might not achieve what your mother is hoping for. Michael laughed for the first time in months. Elena, at this point I think my mother needs to learn that she can't always get what she wants just because she wants it. You've been more than fair in how you've handled this entire situation, and I'm tired of being used as a tool in her efforts to control outcomes that aren't really any of her business. We spent another 20 minutes discussing the practical aspects of a potential transaction, including valuation methods and timeline considerations. By the end of our conversation, we'd agreed in principle that Michael would sell his minority interest to me for $700,000, reflecting the appraised value of his 25% stake. The agreement would require formal documentation and legal review, but it represented a solution that addressed both Michael's desire for independence and my preference for avoiding ongoing complications with his family. More importantly, it would establish me as the sole owner of the property that Patricia had tried to evict me from just 2 weeks earlier. Thursday morning brought a meeting with Margaret Chen to discuss the legal requirements for restructuring the LLC ownership and transferring Michael's interest to me. Margaret was clearly amused by the way the situation had developed, recognizing the irony of Patricia's efforts to remove me from the property, ultimately resulting in my acquiring complete control. This is going to be a relatively straightforward transaction, Margaret explained as we reviewed the necessary documentation. Michael's interest is clearly defined in the operating agreement, and there are no restrictions on transfers between existing members. We should be able to complete everything within 2 weeks. What happens to the LLC structure once I own 100%? I asked. You could maintain it for liability protection purposes, or you could dissolve the entity and transfer the property to your personal ownership, Margaret replied. Given your professional background, you probably want to keep the LLC structure for asset protection reasons. The meeting confirmed that my path to sole ownership was clear and uncomplicated, requiring only standard legal documentation and Michael's cooperation in signing transfer agreements. By the end of the month, I would own the house outright, free from any claims or interference from Patricia or other members of Michael's family. Friday brought the conversation I'd been expecting since Michael and I had reached our agreement. Patricia called with the kind of controlled fury that suggested she'd exhausted her patience with diplomatic approaches and was ready to express her actual feelings about recent developments. Elena, she said without preamble, Michael tells me that you've convinced him to sell you his interest in the house rather than working with me to find a mutually acceptable solution to this situation. I didn't convince Michael of anything, I replied calmly. He made his own decision about what he wanted to do with his ownership stake. Don't pretend this isn't exactly what you planned from the beginning, Patricia snapped, her carefully maintained courtesy finally giving way to genuine anger. You've manipulated this entire situation to end up with complete control of Morrison family property. Patricia, I said firmly, I didn't manipulate anything. I provided the capital and expertise necessary to save your family's house from demolition. I structured the ownership based on each party's financial contribution, and I've responded to your various challenges and proposals in ways that protect my legitimate interests. Your legitimate interests, she repeated mockingly. You mean your scheme to steal my family's heritage through legal technicalities and emotional manipulation? I mean my right to live peacefully in the house that I own, without being harassed by people who refuse to acknowledge legal reality, I corrected. Your family lost this house to foreclosure before I ever became involved. I made it possible for Michael to reclaim it, and now I'm making it possible for him to liquidate his investment and move on with his life. Patricia's response was predictable but still disappointing in its refusal to acknowledge the actual facts of the situation. She'd spent weeks discovering that her assumptions about property ownership, legal relationships, and family authority were completely wrong. but she was apparently committed to maintaining her original narrative regardless of contradictory evidence. "This isn't over," she said finally. "I'll find other ways to address this situation if necessary." "You're welcome to try," I replied. "But I should point out that any future actions you take should be based on accurate information about legal rights and property ownership, rather than assumptions about what you think should be true." After ending the call, I realized that Patricia would probably never accept the reality of my position or acknowledge her mistakes in how she'd handled the situation. Her identity was too invested in being the person who controlled family matters and social arrangements to permit recognition that she'd been completely wrong about something this fundamental. But her acceptance wasn't necessary for me to move forward with my life. The legal documentation of my ownership was clear and enforceable, Michael was cooperating with the transfer of his interest, and I had the professional and financial resources to maintain the property independently of any family involvement. The following week brought the closing on Michael's sale of his interest, a brief and professional meeting in Margaret Chen's office that transferred complete ownership of Morrison Family Properties LLC to me. Michael seemed genuinely relieved to be free of the complications that shared ownership had created, and he expressed appreciation for how I'd handled the various challenges his mother had created. "Elena," he said as we signed the final documents, "I want you to know that I think you've been incredibly gracious throughout this entire ordeal. My mother was completely out of line, and you would have been justified in being much less patient with her behavior." I appreciated his recognition, though I was also aware that our conversation was probably the last substantive interaction we'd have now that our legal and financial connections had been severed. The divorce had ended our marriage, and the property transfer had ended our business relationship, leaving us free to pursue whatever futures we chose without ongoing complications from shared responsibilities. That evening, I walked through the house that was now entirely mine, appreciating details that had taken on new significance now that I didn't need anyone's permission to enjoy them. The renovated kitchen where Patricia had tried to evict me now belonged to me completely. The gardens I'd planted and tended belonged to me. The architectural improvements I'd overseen belonged to me. More importantly, the sense of home I'd created belonged to me in ways that couldn't be challenged by legal threats or social pressure or family disapproval. I'd proven that competence and determination could overcome inherited privilege and assumed authority, and I'd established principles for how I expected to be treated that would serve me well in whatever challenges the future might bring. The next morning brought a call from Jennifer, who'd been following the developments with the professional interest of someone who specialized in complex family disputes. "Elena," she said with obvious satisfaction, "I heard through the legal network that you completed the buyout of Michael's interest and now own the house outright. Congratulations on what has to be the most perfectly executed response to family intimidation tactics that I've ever witnessed." "Thank you," I replied, settling into my office with coffee and the newspaper, though I have to admit the outcome wasn't entirely planned from the beginning. "Maybe not," Jennifer agreed, "but your willingness to stand up for your legal rights and refuse to be bought off sent exactly the right message about how capable women should respond when they're consistently underestimated and dismissed." Her comment reminded me of something I'd been thinking about since the property transfer was completed. The past month's events had been about more than just my personal situation with Patricia and Michael. They'd been about establishing precedents for how professional women should respond when their contributions are ignored and their capabilities are dismissed by people who prefer more convenient narratives about who belongs where and why. By refusing to accept Patricia's buyout offer and insisting on my right to remain in the house I legally owned, I demonstrated that expertise and legal rights couldn't be purchased away by people who found them socially inconvenient. The lesson was relevant to any woman who'd been told she didn't belong in spaces she'd earned access to through her own efforts. The afternoon brought news that Patricia had listed her own house for sale, apparently deciding that remaining in the neighborhood where her former daughter-in-law now owned the Morrison family property was too uncomfortable to tolerate. Caroline called to share this development, along with her observation that their mother seemed genuinely surprised that her various strategies had failed so completely. "She kept saying she couldn't understand how you'd outmaneuvered her," Caroline reported with obvious amusement. "I think she's finally beginning to realize that she spent 4 years underestimating someone whose professional expertise was perfectly suited to exactly the kind of challenges she was creating." Patricia's decision to move away represented the ultimate acknowledgement that she'd lost more than just a property dispute. She'd lost her ability to control a situation through sheer force of will and social authority, and she'd discovered that legal rights and professional competence mattered more than inherited privilege and assumed superiority. More importantly, her departure would eliminate the ongoing source of conflict that had made the neighborhood uncomfortable for everyone involved. I could now enjoy my home without the constant threat of social pressure or family interference, free to build whatever future I chose, without needing to constantly defend my right to exist in spaces I'd earned through my own efforts. 6 months later, I hosted a housewarming party to celebrate the completion of additional renovations I'd undertaken now that I had complete creative control over the property. The guest list included colleagues from my law practice, friends from law school, neighbors who'd become genuine friends, and Caroline, who'd remained supportive throughout the various family dramas. The house had never looked better or felt more welcoming, showcasing improvements that reflected my personal taste rather than inherited family traditions. The professional landscape design had matured into gardens that provided beauty throughout the seasons. The renovated interior spaces flowed together in ways that supported both intimate gatherings and larger entertaining. Most importantly, the house felt like home in ways that went beyond ownership or legal rights. It represented my ability to preserve something valuable, improve it through careful attention and investment, and create spaces that reflected my own aesthetic sensibilities and lifestyle preferences. As I looked around at friends and colleagues enjoying the evening in rooms I'd restored and gardens I'd planted, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since Patricia's attempt to evict me 9 months earlier. Her misconceptions about my legal position and professional capabilities had forced me to assert myself in ways that ultimately strengthened both my personal confidence and my professional reputation. The woman she'd dismissed as an unwelcome gold digger was now recognized as one of the most skilled real estate attorneys in the region, with a growing practice that specialized in complex property acquisitions and dispute resolution. The house she'd tried to remove me from had become a showcase for my abilities and a symbol of what could be accomplished through patience, expertise, and refusal to accept other people's limitations on what I deserved to achieve. Jennifer found me on the terrace as the party was winding down, raising her wine glass in a toast that captured everything I'd been thinking about the evening's significance. To strategic patience and superior preparation, she said with a smile that reflected both professional admiration and genuine friendship. And to proving that competence matters more than inherited privilege. To consequences, I replied, thinking about Patricia's departure from the neighborhood and Michael's newfound independence from family expectations. And to building something better from the wreckage of other people's misconceptions. As the last guests departed and I cleaned up the evidence of a successful celebration, I realized that the past year had taught me invaluable lessons about standing up for myself when others tried to define my worth and capabilities. Patricia's attempt to evict me had backfired spectacularly, resulting in my acquiring complete ownership of the property she'd tried to remove me from, and establishing my reputation as someone who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated by social pressure. The house that had once represented family heritage and inherited privilege now represented something different. The rewards that come to people who combine professional expertise with personal determination, who refuse to accept other people's limitations on what they deserve to achieve, and who understand that sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is simply to prove the underestimators wrong through patient demonstration of actual capabilities. Standing in my kitchen where Patricia had delivered her eviction ultimatum, I appreciated the perfect justice of how the situation had resolved. The woman who'd promised I would get nothing from my association with her family had been catastrophically wrong. What I'd gotten was a beautiful home, professional validation, personal growth, and the satisfaction of proving that legal rights and competent preparation could triumph over assumed privilege and social intimidation. The Morrison family house was now mine completely, preserved and improved through my efforts, free from any claims or interference from people who'd never understood or appreciated what I was capable of accomplishing. Patricia had taught me valuable lessons about standing up for myself, though probably not the lessons she'd intended to impart. Sometimes the best education comes from people who underestimate you so completely that they provide perfect opportunities to demonstrate exactly why their assumptions were wrong from the beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Marriage. Patricia, I said carefully, standing up from the kitchen island and smoothing down my cashmere sweater. "I think you should call Michael before you make any irreversible decisions about the locks." "Why would I need to call my son?" she demanded, her voice rising with the particular brand of indignation that came so naturally to her. "He's in the middle of crucial business negotiations that will determine the future of his career. The last thing he needs is to be bothered with managing his ex-wife's delusions about property ownership." She gestured around the kitchen with proprietary satisfaction, taking in the custom cabinetry, the imported Italian marble, and the professional-grade appliances that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. "This house has been in the Morrison family for generations. Michael's grandfather built it in 1952, his father expanded it in the 1980s, and Michael inherited it when his father passed away 6 years ago. You were simply a temporary occupant who got to enjoy luxuries you could never afford on your own." The historical narrative she'd just recited was partially accurate, which made her confidence understandable, even if it was ultimately misplaced. Michael's grandfather had indeed built the original structure in 1952, and his father had added the West Wing and renovated the master suite in the 1980s. But what Patricia didn't know was that the house had been sold out of the Morrison family estate during Michael's father's final illness to cover mounting medical expenses and business debts. Michael had been devastated when he learned that his childhood home had been purchased by a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring distressed properties from families facing financial crises. The new owners had planned to demolish the house and subdivide the land for a luxury development project. That's when I'd stepped in with a solution that had seemed romantic at the time but now felt like the most prescient business decision I'd ever made. Using my connections in commercial real estate and my understanding of property law, I'd structured a purchase agreement that allowed us to buy the house back from the development company. The transaction had been complex, involving multiple financing arrangements and legal entities designed to protect both the property and our personal assets. Michael had been so grateful and emotionally overwhelmed by the prospect of reclaiming his family home that he'd been happy to let me handle all the legal and financial details. What he hadn't realized, and what I'd never felt the need to explain in detail, was that my legal strategy for protecting the property had required structuring the ownership in a way that would shield it from potential creditors and business liabilities. Given Michael's high-risk career in investment banking, I'd recommended creating a limited liability company to hold the title, with ownership shares distributed based on each party's contribution to the purchase and renovation costs. Since I'd provided 75% of the capital for the purchase through a combination of my own savings, a loan against my law practice, and a creative financing arrangement with the previous owners, the legal structure I'd created had allocated ownership accordingly. Michael owned 25% of Morrison Family Properties, LLC, reflecting his contribution of sentimental value and the 25% down payment he'd managed to scrape together. I owned the remaining 75%, reflecting my substantially larger financial investment in reclaiming his family legacy. The arrangement had made perfect financial and legal sense at the time, and Michael had been so focused on the emotional significance of getting his house back that he'd signed all the paperwork without paying close attention to the ownership percentages. He trusted me to handle the details, and I'd structured the deal to protect both of us while ensuring that the person who'd made the purchase possible retained control over the asset. Now, 3 years later, as Patricia stood in my kitchen demanding that I vacate what she believed was her son's property, I found myself in the unique position